Now that Intel has finally released Battlemage and sent waves across the budget and mainstream GPU segments, a lot of eyes are on Nvidia to see how they would react. The RTX 5060 and 5060 Ti are no doubt going to have a lot of anticipation surrounding them, as the GPU space is dominated by mainstream users, that $200 to $400 bracket, despite all the noise made about high-end cards on social media. However, recent rumors surrounding the RTX 5060 may have gamers jumping out of their chairs. Let's discuss that in this video.
Hey, if you enjoy content like this, drop a like, make sure to subscribe, and smash that bell so you never miss another video.
Hey, what is going on, guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel, and I hope you've all been doing well. We've got some new information coming from WCCFTECH surrounding Nvidia's RTX 5060 and 5060 Ti, and half of it sounds like great news, while the other half is just dreadful. We'll get the bad news out of the way first. WCCFTECH, according to their own sources, state that both the 5060 Ti and 5060 will utilize a PG152 board SKU, and the graphics card will be based on the GB206 GPU chip. Both cards will still utilize a 128-bit bus, which for a 2025 release is honestly quite pathetic, but thankfully, since the 50 series is going to be utilizing GDDR7 memory, most likely from Samsung, and that's going to be running at 28 gigabits per second, which is considerably faster than GDDR6, that should help alleviate the shortcomings for such a slim memory interface. They're reporting the interface would grant the cards a total of 448 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, so comparing that against the 4060, which has a memory bandwidth of 272 gigabytes per second, that's a 65% increase, and compared to the RTX 5060 Ti, that's a 55% increase. There would also be some further improvements coming from the Blackwell architecture due to new memory compression capabilities, so this is a pretty nice jump in bandwidth. You can argue that this is what the 4060 should have came with from the start, but nonetheless, it is nice to see. The amount of bandwidth for a 1080p card is sufficient, granted you have the sufficient amount of VRAM to go along with it, and that leads us into the bad news portion. So according to their sources, they state the Nvidia GeForce RTX 5060 GPU will stick with 8GB of VRAM, which is definitely on the entry-level side of things. Nvidia may change the specs once the higher capacity G7 modules start being mass-produced. With the 3GB modules, we could see the 5060 eventually get 12GB, and perhaps Nvidia may just reserve that for a super refresh. But obviously, it looks like it won't be the case at launch. The higher bandwidth should be there, but the 5060 should be a 1080p card with upscaling, helping it go to 1440p in a few titles. And that last sentence they're talking about, where it being a 1080p card and a 1440p card with upscaling, can be kind of misleading. It can really be taken the wrong way. The first thing I want to establish is that when people talk about gaming at 1440p or any resolution for that matter, it's not adequate enough to just say that I game at 1440p. Because what does that exactly entail? Are you gaming at 1440p, playing games like Counter-Strike, Rocket League, Valorant? Then yeah, the 5060, heck, even an RX 6600 can handle that just fine. But what I think they're referring to, and what most people usually mean, is modern gaming or AAA gaming at 1440p or 1080p. And that's where WCCFTECH would be wrong, because we have seen plenty of examples of these kinds of games like The Last of Us Part 1, Alan Wake 2, Indiana Jones being a card from a recent list of releases, where 8GB just simply is not enough. Performance tanks a lot, there's a lot of stuttering and hitching due to frame time inconsistency because the small memory buffer is just being overloaded. Or what happens is that in order to maintain performance, the game just straight up refuses to load textures properly. Now you can always just lower the settings, right? And I'm someone who's typically always telling folks that honestly, ultra settings are just wasteful, as they're marginally better than high settings, but the performance tax is just too heavy. However, in this case, we're talking about a new card released in the beginning of 2025 that is supposed to be servicing this segment of mainstream gamers for the next 2 to 3 years, and it's not going to age well at all. And I think that a lot of people, when they're buying a new generation card to fulfill that tier or that 1080p gaming bracket, right, they're going to expect it to last and to be able to handle this new generation of games that are coming out. They don't want to buy a card that's $300, $400, and that's considered entry-level budget, and then have to reduce settings just to get a playable frame rate. It's kind of insulting. What I can foresee happening is that reviewers on day one may show the card struggling in modern games released in the last couple of years, or in some of the examples I mentioned, and that really wouldn't be a good look for Nvidia and this card. especially when their competitor just launched a really good value GPU with 12GB of VRAM, providing similar memory bandwidth, and it won't be running into those same problems, at least not for a while until the VRAM requirements creep up and 12GB starts seeing issues, but I don't foresee that being problematic for 1080p, at least not for a while, unless it's like super heavy path tracing. And let's not lose focus and forget who we're talking about here. This is Nvidia, and we know there's going to be a hefty price tag they're going to charge for this card. Even if it's the same price as the 4060 at $299, I'd still consider that overpriced, considering this in reality is a 50 class card, an RTX 5050, but just disguised as the 5060. I know our community is going to call this a joke and DOA, but the reality is that this card will sell a lot because, one, it's Nvidia, and two, it'll be the cheapest RTX 50 series GPU you can get your hands on. And for that reason alone, gamers who aren't really in the know, and trust me, that is the group that actually dominates this market, they're gonna pay for it. Just take a look at the current GPU sellers list, or the top sellers list, and you'll see what I mean. You can go on to places like Reddit and Twitter and take a look at the comments of people making fun of this card, but they're actually a vocal minority. It's just a shame because with the RTX 30 series, we had a 60 class card with 12 gigabytes of VRAM, but Nvidia is just pushing the software elements so hard that they're going to say, oh yeah, with this large amount of cache and DLSS 4.0 with magic frames, this is actually going to perform like a 32 gigabyte card or something absurd like that. The other thing is that Nvidia indulges a lot in upsell tactics, and this leads us into the good portion of the news, I guess, depending on how you look at it. So according to WCCFTECH, the RTX 5060 Ti will have 16 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, the RTX 4060 Ti had two versions, one with 8GB at $399 and one with 16GB at $499. The 4060 Ti 16GB didn't really provide any huge uplift overall when it came to gaming performance over the 8GB version. However, in the instances where VRAM requirements were exceeding 8GB, the difference became pretty noticeable. But I'm hoping that this time around, Nvidia just releases the 16GB version and it's at a more reasonable price because given everything we've been seeing in terms of their attitude towards this market, I wouldn't be surprised if it's just going to sell for $500 or maybe even $550 and they'll call it a day. Seeing the RTX 5060 8GB launch at $399 also wouldn't be far-fetched, so that way people are like, oh, you know what, 16GB for just $100 more, and I wouldn't have to worry about VRAM requirements and it's going to be a faster card. Sure, that works for me. The RTX 5060 and 5060 Ti highlight Nvidia's contrasting approach within the mainstream segment. While the 5060 Ti's 16GB of VRAM is, I guess, a welcome improvement, the 5060's 8GB really feels woefully outdated, relying too heavily on bandwidth to mask its shortcomings and also the software AI element. The stagnation is extremely distasteful, especially when you take into consideration the progress of VRAM in just this past decade. Unless Nvidia prices these cards aggressively, hopefully the general consumer starts questioning the value proposition, especially when AMD and Intel are offering more competitive options. Now shifting our focus to the RTX 5070 Ti, WCCFTECH reports that this card is going to feature 16GB of G7 memory running at a 256-bit interface. This results in a significant bandwidth increase, offering over 896GB per second. That's a massive leap compared to the 4060 and 5060 series we were just talking about. But remember, we're also going to be comparing it to the 4070 Ti Super, which is what the original 4070 Ti should have been from the start. But even then, the memory bandwidth improvement is definitely noteworthy. But there's also another catch. This card is expected to have a TVP of 350 watts. That's quite the jump compared to the RTX 4070 Ti Super at 285 watts, which raises concerns about efficiency improvements with Nvidia's Blackwell architecture. Sure, the G7 memory is faster and more power hungry, but for a card targeting the upper mid-range or high-end market, I was expecting Nvidia to work on reducing power consumption, not really increasing it by that amount. This could also allude to Nvidia pushing the cards pretty hard right out of the gate. Perhaps clock speeds will be improved, where we would see the cards hit 3500 MHz, but if it comes at the cost of drastic power improvements and then the cards only end up being like 10-15% faster than their predecessors, then I don't really see that being worth it. Performance-wise, the RTX 5070 Ti could very well end up matching the 4080 or 4080 Super in gaming. Now, if you consider that to be a significant upgrade over the 4070 Ti Super or vanilla 4070 Ti, that's up to you, or you could consider it a minor upgrade. Though I have seen some very, very outlandish claims from people suggesting that this could be a 4090 minus 10%, which really doesn't make sense to me, considering that this card with the alleged specs is going to have 8,960 CUDA cores, just 6% more than the 4070 Ti Super, and then just faster memory. I don't see how that equates to the 5070 Ti closing the gap or getting within striking distance of the previous generation flagship. Unless Blackwell's architecture is just a drastic leap, I don't really foresee that happening. But given the 16 gigabytes of memory and that kind of power consumption, it's pretty clear Nvidia is aiming this GPU at 1440p enthusiasts or even entry-level 4K gaming. The real question is going to come down to pricing. Honestly, it's all very much up in the air, but I'm personally leaning towards there being some price hikes compared to last gen, especially considering the looming threat of tariffs and G7 being expensive. $899 doesn't seem far-fetched, and then we also have the 5080 and 5090 at the higher tiers. But speaking of the 5080 and 5090, that brings us to the latest leaks coming from Zotac. Video Cards has confirmed that the RTX 5090 will feature 32 gigabytes of G7 memory, which is exactly what enthusiasts have been asking for. Zotac's documentation also confirms the RTX 5080 and 5070 series, though specific details about these cards are sparse. The 5090's 32 gigabytes of memory and a 512-bit bus positions it firmly as a flagship GPU, clearly aimed at ultra high-end gaming and professional workloads. What's exciting is the implication of a CES announcement next month, which aligns with Nvidia's typical launch cycle. For gamers looking at the next generation cards, the 5090 could be an incredible performer, and given the rumors of the upgraded specs, this card is really the only one that stands out and seems like a true next-gen upgrade over from last generation. The rest of the stack seems so lackluster, and that really goes to show you where Nvidia's mentality is at these days. They're going after the big whales, and for the rest of the market, you guys are just gonna get absolute duds in comparison. Pricing wise, it's not going to be cheap. My estimate is $2,000 MSRP, with partner models selling for around $2,300 to $2,500, or I guess in Canadian that's like what, $3,200 plus. Wow, that's just, I didn't imagine we'd be seeing graphics cards competing with used car prices. It's kind of insane. But that's going to wrap it up for this one, you guys, and we'll be touching base in the next video.
If you guys found this video to be informative and entertaining, then leave a like. Let me know your thoughts and comments down below. Be sure to check out the video description for cool links and ways to support the channel, such as using my Amazon affiliate link. And if you're interested in seeing more content like this, then consider subscribing. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.